as the Protestant Reformation was occurring in Europe, the Europeans were also busy exploring the New World. So today we're going to talk about that exploration and discovery. So if you want to follow along, this is Lecture 4, Voyages of European Exploration, Discovery, and Colonization. So if you look at slide 2, I've got a map there, and you can kind of see the areas of the New World that Europe tended to colonize. Spain mostly stuck to present-day Mexico and South America. France explored Canada. The English kind of stuck to the seaboard, the Atlantic seaboard of the present-day United States. The Portuguese colonized Brazil. And we'll kind of talk about these different places today. Now, there's three main motivations for exploration, what I call the three G's: God, gold, and glory. Europe wants to spread Christianity, and now that there's a Protestant Reformation, there's kind of a Catholic-Protestant rivalry to spread their version of Christianity first. Gold, every country wants to get rich. Most of the wealth is located in Asia, in China, India. So the Europeans are looking for new routes to get there. And then glory, every country sends out explorers to kind of win glory for themselves and for their country. Now, these countries colonize in different ways. Some of them just set up trading posts. Some of them establish fringe colonies where they don't really go too far inland. Some countries do all-out settlements. That tended to be more the British model, which we'll kind of talk about that more as we get along today. There are many reasons that the Europeans succeeded in colonizing the New World. Internal divisions among the Indians. This shows up when the Spanish go and conquer the Aztecs and the Incas. The Indian tribes' civilizations were just divided amongst themselves. The Europeans had superior technology such as guns, sailing ships, horses, and war dogs. And probably most importantly, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the rest of the Europeans transmitted diseases to the New World. Unbeknowingly, they did this, so most of the Indians are wiped out by disease. And another reason that they succeeded is just because of their boldness, especially with Cortez and Pizarro. We'll see how bold these conquests were, and that's another reason they succeed. Now, if you look at slide 4, you can see that's kind of a map of the trade routes of the world. What you notice is Europe is on the fringe. Like I said a minute ago, most of the wealth of the world is located in Asia, India, and China. So basically, the Europeans want a way to get there. Now, what attracted the Europeans to the east? Well, like I said, it's the riches of Asia, the spices, the silks, the other riches. There was also a rumor about this ruler named Prester John. He was supposed to be a Christian king ruling somewhere in Asia or Africa. And remember, at this time, the Christians in Europe are still battling the Muslim Ottoman Empire. So the European Christians are always looking for another ally. They thought if they could meet up with this ruler, Prester John, they could find a Christian ally that would help them tip the scales against the Muslims. And curiosity. People are always curious what's out there. We're still exploring space today. So that's kind of what the Europeans were looking at earlier. There's a couple guys that spread some stories in Europe that got people curious. Marco Polo, he traveled to China in the 13th century. He brought back all kinds of riches, spices, dyes, silks, rugs, but he also brings back great stories. He got the nickname Il Million, which means the millions, because he told a million stories. He kind of shook the established view, the European view of the world, because he comes back and he says, hey, there's places outside Europe that are just filthy rich. They've got more technology than we do. So he kind of, like I said, shook the established view of Europe. There's kind of a cool story. On his deathbed, Marco Polo, people told him, like, hey, you're about to die. Will you come clean? Most of the stories that we've heard about aren't real. And supposedly Marco Polo said, I didn't tell you half of what I heard or half of what I saw. So that really got Europeans interested. He also wrote a book that told of his travels, and this kind of excited Europeans. There was another book, The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. This was supposed to be a book that told of the journeys of Sir John Mandeville. He talked about the Fountain of Youth. He talked about cannibals. people that had the heads of dogs. He talked about wolves that were the size of oxen. He talked about ants that would dig for gold, and these ants were the size of dogs. All these crazy stories, but this book turned out to be a fake. It was just made up. It was kind of travel literature fiction. But these stories did attract Europe to kind of have a curiosity about what's out there. Also, Europe is coming out of the Black Death. During the 14th century, the Black Death hit Europe. Maybe a third of Europe is killed. Numbers go from 25 to 75 to 200 million killed. And as population rebounds, the demands for things like spices go up. So that's why they're looking towards the east. Now, how do you get to the east? Well, you do it through the land routes. Now, those are dangerous. You've got mountains, rivers, deserts. You've got bandits that are always trying to steal your merchandise. You've got kings that demand tribute or taxes as you pass through their territory. So land routes are expensive. That requires money, protection, money for protection, and to pay the tribute of the kings. So basically, what ends up happening is land routes are slow, dangerous, and expensive. So the solution, according to Europe, is let's find an all-water route to the east. Let's bypass the middlemen of Italy, the Genoese and the Venetians. The middlemen of Italy, when they would trade overland with the east, they would jack their prices up. So if you're in England, Spain, or France, or the Holy Roman Empire, you have to pay a lot for these things because they came through Italy. So if you can bypass Italy, then you can get these things a lot cheaper. And ships are faster. They don't have to pass through a king's territory. You know, no kingdom claimed a part of the ocean. So when you pass through the ocean, you had to pay taxes. You didn't need protection from bandits. There's not pirates really at this time yet. So basically, if you can figure a way to get there through the water, that's the way to go. So what enabled the water routes to displace the land routes? Well, there's kind of three factors. There's technological advances, there's political changes, and then there's religious events. So there's a lot of new innovations that make ships able to sail farther. There's the astrolabe, there's astronomical tables, there's the plotting board, there's the stern post rudder, which was a better way to steer your ship. There's more accurate maps. There's something called the lateen sail, which is a triangular sail that allows you to sail into the wind. Better hulls are created that are stronger and allow ships to travel farther. I've got some YouTube clips if you want to watch that kind of show the old way of sailing was the galley, and the new way of sailing is something called the caravel. I've also got a YouTube clip about the astrolabe. It's kind of a cool way to measure time and where you are in the world by using this device known as the astrolabe and looking at the stars. There were also these ships called carracks. They were basically huge caravel ships that had towers with gunmen in them that had guns and cannons. Okay. Sorry, I just clicked on a link on accident. Let me pause that. Get back to my slideshow. Okay. So if you look at slide 19, there's two maps of Europe. You can see Europe in the 1300s is very decentralized. But if you look at a map of Europe in the 1500s, you can see that it's starting to become more centralized. What that allows is monarchs start consolidating their possessions into larger dynastic states. You know, the unification of lands leads to an increased taxable base, more funding available for expeditions and military ventures. So basically, as Europe becomes more centralized, you have more resources to go overseas. Also, religious events. I told you about the Protestant Reformation. Europe basically wants to spread its version of Christianity. Okay, so the Portuguese are the first European country to really kickstart exploration, and the person that gets this going is Prince Henry of Portugal. He gets nicknamed the Navigator. He supported the study of ships, geography, winds and currents, navigation. From 1424 to 1434, he sponsors 15 expeditions. And the Portuguese are motivated like everyone else. They want military glory. They have religious reasons. They want to locate that Prester John and ally with him against the Muslims. They want to trade slaves, gold, and other riches. And also, if you look at the map on slide 21, you can see Portugal is basically cut off from Europe. If you get spices into Italy, then they have to travel up through the Holy Roman Empire, France, Spain, and then to Portugal. Every country they travel through, their prices get jacked up. So Spain kind of cut Portugal off from the mainland, so Portugal looks to the ocean. Um, the Portuguese slowly start sailing around Africa and start colonizing places along the African coast. Bartholomew Diaz rounds the southern tip of Africa in 1487. He's caught in a storm. The place that he traveled around gets nicknamed the Cape of Good Hope after it was realized that they had finally made it around Africa. Vasco da Gama is probably the most famous Portuguese explorer. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and he's the one that made the first successful voyage from Europe to Asia through the water. He sailed way out into the ocean. They didn't see land for 93 days. His soldiers got scurvy, which is a vitamin C deficiency. At the time, when they get scurvy, your gums start to rot, your teeth fall out, you get sick. A lot of people thought that this is just because they're away from land for so long. It was thought at the time that humans are meant to be on the land and not out in the ocean for that long. But Vasco da Gama provided a way for Portugal to reach the east and establish their own trade routes, so they can bypass the Italian merchants. His entire voyage took over 2 years and covered almost 25,000 miles. But the pepper and cinnamon that he brought back paid for his trip 60 times over. So financially, this was just a huge windfall profit. The Portuguese also discovered Brazil in 1500. Pedro Cabral found Brazil. And if you look at slide 28, you can kind of see the Portuguese Empire. It's mostly in the east. The Portuguese really weren't looking to the west. And actually, Pedro Cabral, when he found Brazil, he wasn't necessarily sailing west just for its own sake, but kind of to loop around Africa, and he ended up bumping into Brazil. So the Portuguese are mostly focused in the east. And I should say one thing as we're kind of going along, there's too many explorers to talk about. So some of these guys I'm going to skip over pretty quick. I'll kind of tell you the ones I want you to remember. Columbus, definitely remember him. Christopher Columbus, not much is known about his early life. He sailed on a Genoese convoy in the 1470s, and it sunk because Genoa is at war with France. Columbus gets wounded. Supposedly, he floated for 6 miles in the waters off of Portugal and eventually gets to Portugal. There he meets up with his brother, and they set up shop in Lisbon, Portugal. Columbus has a new idea. He doesn't want to sail around Africa to the east. He wants to sail west and go around the world and get to the riches of the east. Columbus knows that the world is round. Most people did. It's kind of a myth that everyone thought the world was flat. The problem isn't that you could do it. The problem is that the ocean is too big. The winds are uncertain. Ships are too tiny to carry enough provisions to get all the way around the world. And sailors fear the ocean. It's just like going out into an abyss. You never know what's going to happen. And a lot of people think that man is not meant to go out on the ocean for this long of a time. Kind of like if you think about before airplanes were invented, men are not supposed to fly. It's kind of that idea. There were a couple brothers, the Vivaldi brothers in the 13th century. They tried to sail west to get to the east, and they never came home. Nobody ever heard from them. Supposedly they're lost at sea. Columbus traveled all throughout Europe, making multiple attempts to get the backing of different monarchs. He went to Portugal, Spain. He went to England. His brother went all over Europe. Spain set up something called the Talavera Commission to basically look into his ideas and see if it's possible to travel west and eventually get east. Basically, he spent the 1480s and 1490s kind of advocating to the different monarchs of Europe to fund his expedition. His plans get shot down. He talks to Spain in 1492. They reject him. Supposedly, there's this story about the finance minister to Queen Isabella basically says, you could pay for his expedition if you took a week off from royal parties and feasts and celebration. That story might not be true, but it's kind of an interesting one. So Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain change their mind, and they end up funding Columbus's voyage. So Columbus is taking his expedition under the name of Spain. And another reason that Spain did this is Spain had been battling the Muslims since the 700s. In the 700s, Islam swept into Spain and conquered Spain, and then the Christian kingdoms had been fighting ever since. So this is known as the Reconquista. So in 1492, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, Granada, fell to Ferdinand and Isabella. So they finally expel the Muslims, and then they're free to focus on exploration. Columbus has some crazy terms. He wants to be called Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He wants to be Viceroy and Governor of all the lands he discovers. He wants a cut, 10% of all the gold and spices that occur through the trade. And he nicknamed his venture the Enterprise of the Indies. In August 1492, he set sail on 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. It's a long voyage. Cooking is done on deck over a firebox. They eat salted meat and hardtack. They drink water and wine. There's constant prayers on the ship for their safety. And if you look at slide 35, I've got a pretty interesting map here. The dotted area is where they thought China and Japan was. So nobody knew that North and South America were in the way. But Columbus thought he could get to China and Japan quicker than was really capable. He underestimated the distance between Europe and Asia. Now, if North and South America had not been there, he would have just sailed and died because they'd have been at sea too long. But thankfully, the continents are there, and he makes it. Columbus keeps 2 journals that talk about the distance travels. One of them he underestimates intentionally so that his sailors don't freak out as much, because every day they were gone, they were worried they were getting too far from Europe. There's talk of mutiny, but they end up spotting land just in time. So October 1492, they spot land. They go ashore and claim the land for Spain. Columbus names the island he landed on San Salvador, which means Holy Savior. Columbus is a very religious person. He thought by traveling to the east, he could get riches for Europe, and that would help them fight the Muslims. Remember, the Crusades are still on people's minds, even though the last Crusade has been over for a couple hundred years. People are still thinking about this. He meets friendly Indians. They're naked. He describes them as very curious. Columbus brings gifts for them. Columbus also enslaves some of them so that they can show him the islands in the area and kind of be translators. He has his first contact with tobacco. He sees some Indians smoking tobacco through their noses. This is kind of a strange sight if you're a European. He does visit some Indian villages that have a few thousand people. Eventually, the Santa Maria runs aground, and they have to abandon the ship. Columbus leaves behind about 40 sailors to start a colony where the Santa Maria crashed. The Nina and the Pinta sail back to Spain to tell the news that they found the East. They thought they'd found the East, but they really hadn't. Columbus reaches home. He goes through Portugal to get to Spain. He meets with King John II of Portugal. Remember, the Portuguese turned him down, so it's kind of an awkward meeting. He continues on to Spain and tells Ferdinand and Isabella about what he heard. He brings back some Indians forcibly. He brings back a little bit of gold. He didn't find a lot. Columbus is really proud of what he has done. Nobody really believed in him. He told everyone the story. It's known as the egg story. He would go to parties because, everyone's celebrating Columbus, and he would get an egg and he would set it on the table and he would say, $5 to the first person that can get it to balance on its top. And nobody can do this because he can't balance an egg. Well, then Columbus comes along and he takes the egg and he smashes the top of it so that it's flat, and then it balances. And, some of the dinner guests grumble that, this is cheating, but Columbus says, that's what everyone says who doesn't know how to do it first. So Columbus kind of likes to live in the glory of what he's done. Columbus went on 3 more voyages. His second voyage is the biggest. He took 17 ships, 1,200 soldiers. He builds the first permanent settlement named Isabella. He actually has battles with the Indians. Um, so I'm not going to talk about all his voyages. You can kind of read about them if you want. And I've got a good book on Columbus that I'll recommend in the module you can look at. Columbus died always thinking he had discovered, or not discovered, had made it to the east, to the riches of the Indies. So he doesn't realize he's found a new continent. Now, this is kind of interesting, but there's a guy named Amerigo Vespucci. He's a Florentine navigator. There's a letter that's attributed to him called the Mundus Novus. That's Latin for New World. And in this letter, called the Mundus Novus letter, he says, the stuff that Columbus found is not the East, it's not the Indies, it's a new world. Well, there's a German map maker named Martin Waldseemüller, and he's making a map, and he makes a map of North and South America, but he doesn't know what to call it. He ends up calling it America in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, not in honor of Columbus. If you look at slide 52, there's something called the Columbian Exchange. This was put forward, I think, in the 1970s by the historian Alfred Crosby, but it basically was the idea that when the explorers from Europe came to the New World, they brought stuff with them, and then they also took stuff back with them to Europe. So the Columbian Exchange is just the transmission of people, foods, animals, diseases, ideas from the New World and the Old World, which is Europe. So you don't have to memorize everything on there, but just kind of look it over, slide 52. Look at what kinds of things went to the New World from the Old World and vice versa. Okay, so the Portuguese and the Spanish are kind of the first two countries to colonize the New World. They end up signing a treaty in 1494 called the Treaty of Tordesillas. If you look at the map on slide 53, you can see basically they draw a line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Everything to the east belongs to Portugal, and everything to the west belongs to Spain. Because, like I said earlier, the Portuguese are mainly focused in the east and the Spanish focused in the west. This was actually done by the Pope. He kind of drew up the treaty and got Spain and Portugal to agree because they're both Catholic countries, and it wouldn't look good in the middle of the Protestant Reformation if two Catholic countries went to war. All right, Ferdinand Magellan, he's another famous sailor. He's actually Portuguese. He served Portugal in their wars against other countries. And basically, he got slighted by the King of Portugal, so he shifts his loyalty to Spain. And Spain really wants Magellan because he has a lot of insider information about navigation and trade with the East. So he's sent by Charles V of Spain, the guy that oversaw the Diet of Worms. He sends him to travel around the world in ships. So from 1519 to 1522, Magellan's 5 ships sail around the world, 270 men. This is one of the most epic exploration voyages in history. There's forced mutinies along the way. Ships are wrecked. There's Magellan has to execute a couple guys for mutiny. There's other mutinies where he takes some of the ringleaders and puts them on an island and just sails away to basically tell the rest of the crew, if you disobey me, I'll stick you on an island somewhere in the Atlantic and we'll just sail off. He eventually sailed around South America. The place he sailed was named after him, the Straits of Magellan. He comes out into the Pacific Ocean, and because it was peaceful after the storm at the tip of South America, he nicknames it the Peaceful Sea. Pacificus is Latin for peaceful, so that's how the Pacific Ocean got its name. He sailed on for 99 days in the Pacific. He eventually reaches Guam in the Philippines. Now, Magellan gets involved in the affairs of the natives. He allies with some against others. Magellan ends up getting killed in the Philippines. Basically what happened is he allied with some Indians who were at war with other Indians. So like 40 Spanish soldiers, sailors, took on thousands of Indians, and they all get killed. Um, Only one ship makes it home with 22 men. The whole journey took about 3 years, 60,000 miles, but it does return a profit. So Magellan never technically made it the whole way. He's killed in the Philippines, but his expedition comes home. Um, some of these guys I'm going to talk about now, I'm just going to go over real quick. Vasco Nunez de Balboa, he fled to the Isthmus of Panama from Cuba. He actually nailed himself in a barrel so he could escape people he owed money. He is technically the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. This is in 1513. He calls it the Great South Sea, but then a few years later, when Magellan sails through, he names it the Pacific. Juan Ponce de Leon, he's the first Spaniard to set foot on the present-day United States. He names Florida. He landed there in the Easter season, so that's how it got its name, Florida. He looked for the Fountain of Youth, but never found it. Panfilo de Narvaez, he explores Florida and the Gulf Coast. He actually dies when some of his rafts capsize in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a few men that survive this expedition. They get captured by Indians once they get to the land, and they walk all over the southwestern United States and then Mexico. Eventually, they make it to Mexico City. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, he's one of the survivors. He makes it to Mexico City in 1536, and he tells stories about all these riches that they had heard along their way, and that inspires a lot more Spanish explorers to go see this new wealth. Hernando de Soto, he leads an expedition all over the southeastern United States. He was known for his cruelty to the Indians. He would kidnap them, put them in chains, mistreat them. He's the first European to cross the Mississippi River. He eventually dies, so his men bury him in the Mississippi River because they don't want the Indians to find out their leader has died, because then they might revolt against the Spanish. Francisco Coronado, he's sent out to find some of the rich cities that De Vaca talked about. He explores the American Southwest in 1540, 1541. Their expedition sees buffalo. They see the Grand Canyon. He made it to modern-day Kansas. Juan de Onate, he leads an expedition from Mexico City. Eventually, this expedition founds the city of Santa Fe, which is in modern-day New Mexico. Okay, so some of those guys, if you want to read more about them, I'll give you some books to read, but they're not the main ones I want to focus on. I want to focus on a new group of people known as conquistadors. These are conquerors. They're not explorers, they're conquerors. They're going to conquer Indian civilizations. The three great Indian civilizations of the New World are the Aztec, the Mayas, and the Incas. And if you look at slide 68, I've got some documentaries. These Indian civilizations are really fascinating. So if you want, you should click on some of these. You can watch them. They're about 45 minutes to an hour. So if you have some extra time, it's really interesting. But we're going to look at Hernan Cortez and the Aztecs. So the Aztecs, they're a mighty empire that's located in modern-day Mexico. They're kind of at the height of their power when the Spanish show up. They settled in the middle of Lake Texcoco in the 1300s. Their ruler is Montezuma, or Moctezuma II. Their chief city is Tenochtitlan. It's larger than any European city. Maybe 200 to 500,000 people live there. It's fed by floating islands. It's watered by aqueducts. It's connected to the mainland by 3 causeways. It's in the middle of the lake. If you look at slide 72, you can see some pretty amazing pictures or diagrams, models of what it may have looked like. If you look at slide 74, they had aqueducts. They had that watered gardens. They had baths that the king would bathe in that were fed by aqueducts, and these are some of the ruins. Now, the interesting thing about the Aztecs is they have a lot of trouble with their fellow Indians, because the Aztecs' religion teaches that the gods made the world through the sacrifice of their blood. So they think that you need human blood to keep the world going. So the Aztecs practice human sacrifices, and they don't get the humans from their own tribe; they get it from fellow Indian tribes. In 1487, there's a 4-day sacrifice. There may have been from 4,000 to 80,000 people sacrificed. The numbers vary, but this makes the Aztecs a very hated tribe by their fellow Indians. The Aztec military was very organized. They had these specialized warriors known as the Jaguar and Eagle warriors. They had archers, slingers. They wore bright feathers into battle. They had very varying weapons. The Makwahidal is this wooden club with razor sharp obsidian, and you would basically like swing it and cut your enemy. They had the Atlatl, which is kind of a dart throwing device. If you look at slide 77, you can click on those YouTube links. Those are just 5 to 10 minute videos that show you how these weapons work. It's pretty cool. Okay, so who's going to conquer this huge Aztec empire? It's Hernando or Hernan Cortez. Around 200 Spanish ships sailed the Atlantic Ocean in the first 2 decades of the 16th century. New Spain is headquartered in Cuba, but they hadn't really looked at the mainland too much. In 1518, the governor of New Spain picks Cortez to conquer Mexico. He lands in Mexico in 1519 with around 500 men. These conquistadors have steel swords, helmets, body armor. They have crossbows. They have arquebuses or arquebusers. Those are kind of an early form of the musket. They have light cannon. They have war horses and war dogs. So basically what happens is he marches inland from Veracruz to conquer the Aztec Empire. He conquers the Indian tribes that are nearby the Aztecs, and he allies with them. So even though he only has a few hundred men, he ends up getting thousands of Indian allies along the way because the Aztecs are very hated. Eventually, Montezuma invites Cortez into the city of Tenochtitlan, and Cortez ends up kidnapping him and putting him under house arrest in his own city. That's pretty bold for a few hundred Spanish to kidnap the Indian king in a city of maybe 500,000 people. Now, as this is going on, Cortez had been in some trouble with his Spanish overseers. They actually land in Mexico. The governor lands in Mexico to arrest him. So Cortez goes back and actually fights a group of Spaniards, and then he gets the rest of those, the ones he defeated that want to join him, and then he goes back into the capital, Tenochtitlan. Order breaks down. There's some Spanish that kill some Aztecs. Eventually, Montezuma is killed. They think the Aztecs killed him because they saw him kind of as a traitor, going along with the Spanish. Cuauhtemoc is the new emperor of the Aztecs. He attacks the Spanish. The Spanish try to escape on the night of July 1st, 1520. This is the sad night, La Noche Triste. Cortez escapes, but he loses about half his men. A lot of Spaniards drown. Some of them get captured by the Aztecs, and the Aztecs take them to their temple and rip out their hearts and throw their bodies down the side. The Spanish can hear the screams of their fellow Spaniards who get captured, so it's not a nice place to be. So Cortez escapes Tenochtitlan. He gathers more Indian allies, and he goes back and he fights the siege of Tenochtitlan. And one of the reasons he's successful is while he's gone building up this army, the Aztecs face diseases, and a lot of them end up dying. But Cortez comes back and fights the Aztecs. There's months of street fighting. Cortez cuts off the aqueducts, the food supplies, the causeways, and in August of 1521, Tenochtitlan falls. The Aztec emperor, Cuauhtemoc, the last one, he's tortured and killed. Okay, so why did the Spanish defeat the Aztecs? They have better military technology. They've got guns, cannon, horses, dogs, body armor, swords. They've got better naval technology. Their ships can traverse the oceans. Disease wiped out a lot of the Aztecs. The Aztecs oppressed their Indian neighbors, so when Cortez showed up, a lot of Indians were willing to fight on his side against the Aztecs. And I think you got to give it to Cortez. His boldness helped win as well. Okay, the other big conquest is the conquest of the Incas. If you look at slide 87, you can see where the Inca Empire is. Now, the Inca Empire is pretty impressive. They had storehouses, they had roads, they had runners to carry messages all throughout their empire. Atahualpa is their ruler. Now, right before the Incas are conquered by the Spanish, the Incas have a civil war amongst themselves, um, and they end up fighting against each other. So they were pretty weak when the Spanish showed up. But Francisco Pizarro is the one that conquers the Incas. Um, so the Incas are divided by civil war, and they also experienced what was probably a smallpox epidemics in 1527. But like I said, civil war, Atahualpa ends up coming out ahead. And in the 1530s, Pizarro shows up with just over 150 men. So once again, hundreds of thousands of Incas, a few hundred Spanish conquistadors. What ends up happening is Atahualpa wins his civil war and he comes out to meet the Spanish. Now, he has an army of maybe 40 to 80,000, but what ends up happening is Atahualpa takes 7,000 Incas to go meet the Spanish. So there's, less than 200 Spaniards versus 7,000 Incas, and then a larger Incan force just a little bit of ways. And what happens is these couple hundred Spaniard conquistadors end up fighting the 7,000 Incans. They end up killing most of them. It's a slaughter, and they take Atahualpa captive. They ransom him for gold. Atahualpa says, I will fill up this room full of gold, and that can be my ransom. So the Incas bring a lot of gold to the Spanish, and they melt it down, and then there's a lot of wealth. But what ends up happening is Pizarro has Atahualpa killed anyways. Okay, so the Aztecs and the Incas are conquered by Spain. If you look at slide 92, you can see how Spain is growing a large empire, larger in land than Portugal did. How do they govern this area? Well, they set up something called a viceroyalty. They had four of them. New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and La Plata. If you look at slide 93, you can kind of see the map. Each viceroyalty was ruled by an imperial governor. He's the direct representative of Spain. Spain does not allow self-government in the New World. That's really important to remember. Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, France, they don't really allow self-government, but the English do. The Dutch might have been kind of in the middle, but New Spain is ruled directly from Spain. So if you come to the New World as a Spaniard, you don't get to make decisions for yourself like the English will. They also had something called an audiencia. This was a group of 12 to 15 judges who kind of served as a council to the imperial governor. The Spanish colonies in the New World grow very slowly. By the 1570s, there were only 160,000 or so Spaniards. There's different reasons for the slow growth. There are pirates in the Caribbean. That's actually a thing, and they make it dangerous. There's hurricanes. It's difficult to travel. And there's also this idea of mercantilism. I'll explain that here in a minute. And also, like I said, Spain did not encourage self-government. So let's say you're an oppressed Spanish peasant in Spain. If you go to the New World, you're still going to be oppressed. You're not going to be able to like climb the social ladder. That's different with England. If you're in England and you don't have it that great, you can go to the New World and you can make it rich. You can move up the ladder. Okay, let me explain mercantilism. This is an economic theory that dominates Europe in the 14, 15, 1600s. Later on, it kind of dies out towards the end of the 1700s. But mercantilism is basically the idea that there is a limited amount of wealth in the world. And wealth is measured in terms of gold, silver, and other valuable metals and resources. And the way you get rich as a nation is you get as much of this gold and silver as you can. So basically, New Spain, their job was to transfer wealth back to Old Spain, European Spain. So Spain doesn't primarily see the New World as a place to go and create a new civilization. England is the main country that says, We want to take all of our values and transfer them to the New World. That's not really what Spain was about. I've got kind of this example of a pie. If you look at slides 96, 97, and 98, there's only a certain amount of gold in the world. So if you want to get rich as a nation, you've got to take that gold from someone else, and that's like a piece of a pie, right? There's only so much pie in the world. So if you're Britain and you want to get richer, you have to get richer at the expense of Spain and France, let's say. So if you get more wealth, if you get more pieces of the pie, that means Spain and France have less pieces of the pie. Now, this is going to change once we get into capitalism and Adam Smith, but that's for another day. Huge treasure fleets would travel from the New World to Spain, bringing lots of silver and gold. Spain set up something called the encomienda system. Basically, the Spanish crown granted conquerors the right to employ Indians as labor, basically as slaves. So the Spanish enslaved the Indians, and the Indians are supposed to give their labor, but then the Spanish are supposed to give the Indians food and shelter. So there's supposed to be a two-way street, but it doesn't usually end up being that way. The labor is very harsh, and a lot of Indians die. Some Spaniards spoke out against this. Bartolomé de las Casas, he spoke out against this cruel treatment. He was a Spanish priest. And what ends up happening is you have the introduction of slavery, or I should say African slavery. Indian tribes had slaves, so slavery existed in the New World long before the Europeans got there. But how does slavery become racial? Well, what ends up happening is in Europe, slavery had existed in the Middle Ages, but it's not racial. Europeans sold white Europeans as slaves. What ends up happening is in 1453, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantium Empire, this European empire collapses. The Muslims conquer it. So the traditional source of slavery for Europe was Eastern Europe, the Black Sea region. That is now gone. The Muslims control that slave trade. So what ends up happening is Europe has to look away from the Black Sea region, and they look to Africa. And about 1453, when Constantinople falls, that's the same time the Portuguese are traveling down Africa. So Europe loses its slavery base, or its source of slaves in Eastern Europe. They end up changing that to Africa. In 1444, the first African slaves came to Lisbon. At first, Portuguese slave traders just capture slaves in coastal raids in Africa, but eventually they realized that if they work with the African kingdoms to do slavery, it's much more efficient. So African kingdoms in slavery enslaved their fellow Africans and then sold them to the Europeans. Between 1490 and 1530, around 300 to a couple thousand slaves from Africa would come to Lisbon every year. And eventually slavery takes off because of sugar. So slavery might not have grown very much, but because of sugar, it shoots up exponentially. And if you look at slide 103, you can kind of see a map. Most slaves from Africa go to South America and the Caribbean. They don't go to North America. A lot do, but not percentage-wise, not most of them. Okay, here's how sugar made slavery more intense, or more of a practice in the New World. Sugar is a luxury item. Europe can't really afford it, but as Europe starts to rebound from the Black Plague and population rises, demand grows for sugar. Now, sugar is very labor intensive. You've got to plant the seed stems by hand. You've got to harvest it really quickly because it spoils real quickly. And the growing season for sugar is continuous, so there's never a resting period. And they start coming up with new technology to process sugar. You basically have to crush the sugar, and then the juices spill out, and then you have to boil them. Well, as you get more technology that makes sugar production quicker, it doesn't really do any good to have a machine that makes it quick if you can't keep up with the labor. So as new technologies make you able to process more sugar, you've got to have a lot of labor to allow that machine to basically make more sugar. So as technology increases the efficiency of sugar, you need more slaves. So demand in labor creates more of a demand in slaves. In 1518, Charles the First, he authorizes traders to bring African slaves to the New World. Um, Portuguese bring the first slaves to Brazil around 1550. By 1600, about 4,000 African slaves are taken to the New World. The Dutch West India Company gets involved in this. The English Royal African Company gets involved in this. So there's companies in Europe set up just to mainly take slaves to the New World. This passage from Africa to the New World is known as the Atlantic Passage. Um, there's high death rates on these ships. The slaves, the Africans, are packed in very tightly. There's poor food, poor sanitation. There's cramped spaces. Um, Around 10 million slaves or Africans are transported across the Atlantic Ocean as slaves from 1518 to 1800. Sometimes around 20% of them died annually. That number went down as slave owners realized that it's very profitable to keep your slaves alive. The 17th century was the peak of the slave trade, and I'm going to have you read something from a pretty good book that kind of goes into some of this. Um, in addition to sugar, silver was also a big thing that the Spanish discovered in the New World. There's this place called Potosi. It was an empty place, but after the Spanish found gold, 160,000 people moved in there 50 years later. Um, it the Spanish mines in the New World account for 60% of all the silver in the world. Annual treasure fleets would take this silver back to the New World. And basically, tons of money goes from the New World to the Old World. This actually drove up prices in Europe and actually wrecked a lot of economies in Europe. So that's kind of an introduction to some of the exploration. Next time, we're going to look at some of the English, the French, the Dutch explorers, and then we'll be done with exploration.